Here we are at the last video in phase 2. In the prior 3 videos, we focused on digestive secretions and working to optimize them. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a different aspect of gastrointestinal health, specifically motility. Now, how many bowel movements do you have per day? Do you have a bowel movement every day, like clockwork? You should be having multiple per day, at least 2. But that's not the full story. What's the quality of your bowel movement? Are they well formed and a consistent dark brown color? Do you feel like you completely empty your bowels when you have a bowel movement? You know the answers to these questions, and if they're not being answered appropriately, we need to dig deeper here. So chances you answered negatively to a couple of these questions, and that means that you're not emptying your bowels ideally. We could label this as constipation, but that is truly too narrow of a term to explain the bowels in total. Here's why it matters. The slower your bowels move, the higher the risk of SIBO. The opposite is also true. The more routinely and completely you empty your bowels, the less chance you have of developing SIBO. This is because food should only stay in the small intestine for a limited amount of time before it moves on into the large intestine. And if it does not, all of the bacteria that should be transitioning into the large intestine, well, they're getting stuck in the small intestine and they're beginning to overgrow. They're starting to ferment things and they're creating symptoms for you. Otherwise, what you know as small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So now, before you start running to the typical recommendations to improve bowel motility, hit the brakes. We are not interested in more fiber in your diet and the next gut stimulating herb that is going to leave you in more of a mess than you're currently already in. These things have been promoted for so long, but almost everyone gets worse that starts to use them. They don't feel better, they feel bloated. So no wonder these can increase bloating and gas. They're all irritating your gut lining. So with that in mind, let's talk about the real reason that your gut is not moving adequately, and there are 2 interconnected reasons. Number 1 is going to be the microbes in your gut, the bacteria specifically that we're talking about here. These bacteria have a very significant influence over motility, very significant, and they interact directly with the nervous system around your gut. Let me introduce you to a new term here. This is known as the enteric nervous system. So I want you to hang on to that term because we're going to come back to that. But what these bacteria do in your gut is they produce serotonin. Serotonin enhances the contraction of the muscles via the nervous system in your gut, that enteric nervous system. And when you activate these contractions, when you have a bowel movement, that is the activation of these contractions. However, if you have low serotonin, that's going to be associated with slower motility most of the time. And one of the ways that you can know that you're dealing with low serotonin is if you also are dealing with things like a lack of pleasure. Just you don't get pleasure from things that you do. If you're dealing with outright depression, or if you find that you're being the hermit and you're having social withdrawal, you don't want to be around people. Those can all be indications of low serotonin. And if that's also showing up at the same time that you have slow motility in your bowels, constipation if you will, then that could be an indication that serotonin and potentially these microbes aren't doing what they need to be doing. Now remember that there's multiple roles that these microbes are doing here. So let me introduce you to another one. They're going to produce fermentation products that directly stimulate your enteric nervous system. And again, I'm coming to the enteric nervous system, this nervous system around your gut. And this is in contrast, the beneficial bacteria produce fermentation products that stimulate your bowels, but this is in contrast to these organisms that were overgrowing in the overgrowth phase. They're going to produce compounds that actually worsen constipation. They can start to produce excess methane. Methane slows down the motility. Maybe if you're in a scenario where you have the opposite, diarrhea, maybe you've got too much hydrogen. But for those individuals that have slow motility in their bowels, you're probably dealing with more of a methane issue. In addition, here's another mechanism where we start to look at how these microbes function. They're also going to regulate bile acid synthesis in the liver. So follow me on this. The bacteria in your gut are directly influencing the production of bile in your liver that then goes to the gallbladder to be concentrated and then released into the small intestine. Remember from our prior video that bile is going to act as what we consider a physiological stimulant to actually enhance bowel motility. So you need that bile, and with these microbes present, they're actually helping you get adequate bile production. Now, before I transition away from microbes, I do want to say another word on fiber and be fair about how I present fiber. Not all fiber is bad, but it's dose dependent and it's dependent on when you use it. And so in these early phases like we're talking about right now, fiber is not ideal. But increasing fiber over time can be advantageous because it does allow the microbes to be more productive. So it may end up relieving constipation via actually helping optimize the microbes. But again, don't start here, build up. We want to slowly increase that fiber over time. All right, so that's what I wanted to share with you about the microbes. Now let's transition over to the nervous system. This is going to be the other part of this interconnection that I talked about that's going to help or that's going to affect your motility. And remember, when we talk about the nervous system, there's the nervous system that you're familiar with. We have two different nervous systems. There's the central nervous system, and again, that's the one you tend to think about. And there's the enteric nervous system. That's the one that's in and around your gut. And the central nervous system and the enteric nervous system both play a role here. The central nervous system, let me just start with that one because I want to finish up with the enteric nervous system for you. But the central nervous system has a direct hand in constipation and bowel motility as well. And it does this by the action that it has on, believe it or not, the hormonal system. So your nervous system affects your hormonal systems. These are interconnected. Sound familiar? It does this by regulating what's known as our sympathetic and our parasympathetic response. You're going to notice this or know this as the difference between your fight or flight mechanisms and your rest and digest mechanisms. And when you're having a greater activation in your central nervous systems of those fight or flight mechanisms, well, your autonomic nervous system regulates motility, and when you're fighting and fleeing, your bowels moving is not that important at that moment. Fighting and fleeing is a priority for you, so you're going to see a decrease in bowel motility if that sounds like you. Anxiety can also be another factor here that can play into this, and if you're dealing with anxiety, then this may resonate with you quite a bit. So that's the central nervous system. Well, let's move over to the enteric nervous system, and I've talked to you just a little bit about it already, but the thing to note about the enteric nervous system is that it can act completely independent of your central nervous system. It has its own sensory, it can sense things, triggers that are giving it input. It has its own motor function, meaning that it can stimulate the muscles in and around your gut. And when you look at trying to support it, it's going to be directly stimulated by byproducts of the bacteria. Here again comes the interconnectedness. The bacteria produce something called short-chain fatty acids. These are often termed postbiotics. You've heard about people talking about prebiotics or probiotics. Well, there's also postbiotics. And these are just the byproducts that the beneficial bacteria make. But there's one group of these that they make known as short-chain fatty acids that directly stimulate the enteric nervous system, and that ends up promoting gut transit and bowel motility. So contents move through your gastrointestinal tract much more efficiently. Now, keep in mind that there is definitely a crosstalk between the nervous system and the microbiota, the bacteria in your gut. Those two are not interacting or not acting in isolation. They are interacting together. And we often term this the microbiota, gut, brain, axis. So just to give you context of how the gut, the brain, and the microbiota all are going to interact together. And that's not a one-way communication. It actually works both directions. So there's input going from the brain to the microbiota, and there's input going from the microbiota back to the brain or back to the nervous system. And so when that is disrupted, that ultimately is going to lead to that imbalance of the microbiota. And fortunately, you were able to correct that already in phase 1 of the SIBO solution. But on to the motility, or back to the motility conversation. How do you correct it? This is really what we need to get to the gist of, is how do I correct this motility issue? Well, first of all, you can start with just adding bile acids. I talked to you in the last video about using beta plus as a source of bile acids, but remember, bile acids are a physiological laxative. Not a laxative to the point that you're going to be running to the bathroom and dumping your bowels. They're just going to naturally stimulate bowel motility. And so they're also going, these bile acids are also going to stimulate and affect the movement of electrolytes and water in your bowels. Well, it turns out this is also going to affect constipation. The drier that fecal material becomes, the greater the probability for constipation. So we do need to have a water component to our stool. And so low bile acids, well, that's often seen with constipation. So we need to do something to correct that. The next thing that we can do is we can increase mucus production. So think about mucus as that slimy, slippery material, if you will, substance that the body produces at times. Well, that naturally lines your gastrointestinal tract, and that slipperiness, if you will, is part of what enhances motility. And this is often, the lack of mucus production is often secondary to a lack of a chemical called acetylcholine. You might think about acetylcholine as being linked to brain speed. So when individuals are feeling like their memory's not good, they're being absent-minded, dealing with brain fog, that can be a lack of acetylcholine. Well, the way that we can get this chemical back up in the body is through our microbiota. Turns out, just like with dopamine and serotonin, they also produce this chemical. So when we enhance the microbiota, they produce acetylcholine, and acetylcholine stimulates the production of mucus. Now, we can also look at the ability of the probiotics to support your motility in your bowels as well. So when it comes to probiotic support, the idea here is really to feed the bacteria. And we can do this a couple of different ways. We have two predominant options that we can look at. There's others, but let me stick to these two. The first one is fiber. And we talked about how fiber is not optimal at this phase. Fiber is something that should be considered later on, but fiber is not what you want to consider initially when it comes to SIBO. The second that you can look at are plant antioxidants. If you've ever heard the terminology of polyphenols or flavonoids, these are the groupings of compounds that we're talking about. And I'll give you one example here that can be beneficial, and that's going to be ginger. And ginger can stimulate the growth and activity of the probiotics. It's by no means the only one that can do that. There's numerous of these that can stimulate these probiotics. But the point is that when they are more active, they're going to be able to carry out all these secondary roles that they have, all of which are going to enhance bowel motility. And then lastly here for you in terms of what we can do and how we can correct this is that we can support the nervous system. And we can do this by using serotonin precursors to directly support serotonin. There's the quick fix, but we want to really think long term here. So on the quick side, we can use a compound called 5-hydroxytryptophan. That can start to get the bowels moving. It can start to be the stimulus that the bowels need to be able to move more regularly. But long term, we want to think beyond that. If you don't have adequate sleep, if you don't have good social interaction, if you're not getting optimal protein intake, these are all things that are going to inhibit your inherent ability to produce serotonin. And so we want to be able to get good sleep. We want to interact with other people and enjoy our interactions. We want to make sure that we're consuming optimal protein in our diet. This is going to give us the capacity to make serotonin, and that in turn is going to translate into better motility in the bowels. Additionally, as it relates to this serotonin conversation, we also want to control inflammation. Now, this can get well beyond the scope of this particular course, but just know that when you start to change your diet and you're improving your diet, you're reducing your inflammation, and that reduction in inflammation is going to have a direct impact positively on your nervous system. So let me address one final thing here in this topic, and that is, well, what if your motility is not too slow, but it's actually too fast? Well, most loose stools and diarrhea is actually a byproduct of dysbiosis. It's the byproduct of where we started out in phase 1 of the SIBO solution here. It's an imbalance of the gut bacteria. And everything that I've been sharing with you in phase 2, well, that can continue to maintain that balance that you've already created by fixing your dysbiosis. So we want to focus on adequately digesting and maintaining stability in our small intestine. All right, there you go. Not just an overview on motility, but a deep dive into what affects the motility of the gut and how to address it. So let's take a quick recap where we're at this point. In phase 1, you worked on decontaminating your gut, removing that overgrowth. The phase 1 supplement kit allowed you to effectively reduce the overgrowth in your small intestine. In phase 2, the focus has been on digestion and motility. But there is more taking place than just digestion. You are also killing off bacteria and other organisms that would be overgrowing in your small intestine. The addition and consistent use of stomach acid, pancreatic enzymes, and bile, that's going to maintain and further improve the changes that you've created in your gut. Plus, this is only made better by everything you learned in this video to enhance your motility. So let's close out here and acknowledge that by implementing the recommendations that I have given you, you're going to see an improvement in your gut function. And this is what your gut's been asking for. This is what you've been looking for, is a better, healthier, more stable, long-term environment in your small intestine. But we're not done yet. This video is the completion of phase 2. However, our last phase, phase 3, is still to come. The focus of phase 3 is going to be correcting the nutrient deficiencies that have been developing while you've been dealing with SIBO and kicking your metabolism into high gear. I'll see you in phase 3.